The Lochsa River in Idaho is the destination for our next episode of Painting and Travel. Sarah explores the densely forested campground, while Roger uses oil paints to capture the fast-fading afternoon light on a river landscape.
We're in the state of Idaho. Often when we travel across the nation, we look for a campground, and we found a lovely one here. This campground is especially nice because there are lots of trees, beautiful fir trees, some of which are at least 100 feet tall, as far as I can tell, and they smell delicious. The pine scent wafts up from the ground in the evening when you get ready to sleep, and it's just a lovely fragrance. Now, Roger fell in love with the looks of the river over there, and we found out we're in the same area that Lewis and Clark traveled in the early 1800s. They were famous explorers, as you know. And Roger likes the looks of the river, so he's going to find a view that he wants to paint. We'll go down there and find out just exactly what he's thinking about painting.
This is a beautiful river. The sun is starting to go down, so I'm going to get started right away. But I like the way the green is shining on this grass down here. We got some nice contrasts here and some beautiful shapes. I'm going to use oil paints today, and on my palette I have titanium white, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, alizarin crimson. I have two yellows, Indian yellow and cadmium yellow light, and I have one green, a chromium oxide green, which is very opaque. I'm using an 11 by 14 piece of masonite covered with gesso, of course, but I toned it with a bit of burnt sienna. Just squirted some burnt sienna on there, sprayed it with a little water, and washed it around. I used acrylics on that so it would dry very fast. In just a matter of minutes, it's dry and will give me a nice base to start with and get rid of all that bright white. We have another beautiful view looking this way. Just about everywhere I turn here, I've got some really pretty views. Gee, I love the way this dark color is coming down here on this side of the bank, putting those trees in shadow. But right now I'm going to use a line drawing just to sketch out the outline and the shape of what I want to draw here. We were here last evening, and what really attracted me to this location was this beautiful bright yellow-green down here by the river. I think this might make a nice composition because everything here sort of points in to where the center of interest will be. These mountains, these trees, the river, and the grass all focus around this area. Now I think I'll move this area over a little this way because I don't want the center of interest right in the middle of the board. So we'll put the center of interest here. So I may move that river just slightly this way. We have one large tree here, and we have some bushes that kind of cut into this area here. A lot of nice shapes going on. It cools off here at night, but wow, during the day this is blazing hot sun. But since I'm using oils today, I won't have the problem with paints drying as quickly as I would if I were to use the acrylics. This is the area here with the shadows that are on the other side of the river. I'm going to stay away from using white right now for as long as I can, and I'm just going to put this in as a wash, a thin wash of paint. If I was using acrylics, it would dry very quick. I could paint over this, but this is going to stay wet during the entire painting here. So I want to keep this paint thin at this point. If I were to use paints that were too thick at this point, it would be hard to go over them again with some other colors. Now this chromium oxide green, I said I'd stay away from the white for as long as I can, and I try and stay away from the opaque colors for as long as I can. But in this case, this chromium oxide green is very opaque. I'm going to put it on here rather thin, but I won't add any white to it yet. And I don't want to make it very green right off the bat. I want to save this brilliant green for these areas down here. So even though this tree has some quite brilliant green on it, I want to make this dark to start with, and then later on I'll put some lighter greens over this. And the reason is because trees being dark like they are, what I'm seeing in here is the darkest part of the tree. When I see all the pine needles and all on the outside, that's the outer part of the tree. So really what I'm doing here is I'm painting the inner part of the tree. So I'll work from the inner part of the tree, work out, put my light colors over these darks. I'll use the chromium oxide green again, put a touch of yellow in it, and maybe a touch of red. I'm going to use this again thin and put these mountains in back here. I need a little more blue there because that is in the distance. Some more cerulean blue. Push that back in the distance. I don't want to get these oil paints too thin either, because if they're too thin, they tend not to dry very fast either, and they just tend to get really soupy. What I really want to do now is just cover these areas and get my patterns going. Okay, yellow. Get my bright yellow there. I've already got some green on the brush from before, so I'll just take that yellow, put it right in here, and try to begin to establish these nice colorful patterns. Now on that side of the river, we've got these large trees and they're casting shadows across the water. Generally in oils, I like to work from dark to light. So I'm going to take my cerulean blue and pick up a touch of this green here, and I'm going to make this river basically all this dark blue color. I'll come back in a little while and I'll put some of the lights over it. Again, being careful not to put too much paint on here to begin with. Of course, you could if you wanted to. I mean, all this is a matter of choice, and some people like to start out using very heavy paints, and that's perfectly all right. I'm just doing it this way. I'm more used to it. It seems to work for me. So there are no right or wrong rules to painting like this. Basically, we love to get out here and enjoy ourselves and just experience this beautiful country. Well, now I'll pick up some titanium white. I'll mix it with my cerulean blue and I'll lay in this sky. Again, I'm putting this in rather thin to start with because I may have to adjust the colors. What is very nice about oils is that it does cover so very well. Acrylics don't always cover on the first pass like oils do. Bad part about oils is it's very easy to mix one color with another color, and paints can get muddy very fast. That's why I wanted to lay out these basic shapes to begin with as close as I could to what I thought they would end up being. Of course, one disadvantage to using oils is if I'm painting this sky and I bump into this green, that green's going to mix with the blue and it'll cause a muddy color, or a color that I don't want. So that's why I was trying to be as careful as I can to get these shapes as accurate as I could. The only way to resolve any issues like that is to either wipe it off with a rag or apply heavier paint to the board or the canvas. Now in oil paints, it's much easier to paint your lights over the darks. If you try and paint darks over light colors, they become chalky very quickly. I'm picking up a smaller brush now, and I'll try and paint some of this water in here. It's not really a blue color, it's not really a green color. It's sort of a grayish green color, so I'll take some red in there and just mix this till I get what I think is a sort of the right color. Now I use a palette that is gray here, so when I mix this gray here, I can tell that this is a little bit below middle value, this gray here, because this is middle value. I think that's maybe what I want right in here. Nope, as soon as I put it there, it's a little too light. I also have to be careful that when I paint this water here, I need to be able to leave a light value to paint these rocks in here. If I get this too light, then those rocks aren't going to show up very well. So painting is always a back and forth game. Ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and some of the Indian yellow. It's going to give me a very, very dark color. Now I'm going to paint these trees that are back in here, these real darks. As I said earlier, it's harder to paint darks over lights, but this isn't really light. This is quite dark to begin with. Now, as I squint my eyes, which is always a good thing to do when painting, as I squint my eyes, the darkness of these trees and the riverbank and the water up here is close to the same value. So this may be slightly on the light side. So I'll bring that down in value some. We'll jump back up to these trees in the distance where this mountain is. Use some cerulean blue, and I've got some white in it now, and maybe a touch of ultramarine blue. And these mountains are quite blue up there. I want to make them look like they're a little further in the distance than they are. So I'm going to make them lighter and cooler because I want these to appear like they're in the far distance. Now that I've got that on, we can just drag this down. Now anything in the distance like this, there will not be as much detail. So I'm going to flatten this so I don't see as much texture in there. I obviously see texture when I look up there, but if I compare the texture with that up there with the texture of anything close here, the texture is a lot less. So we'll flatten this out, and I won't have that much texture in this area of the mountains here. I want to keep this edge right here soft. That will also express some distance. Now these trees here, this bank of trees here, it also slopes in this way, but I don't want to repeat this shape right here. In other words, I don't want this mountain to be going down at this angle, and I don't want to repeat that bank of trees going down at the same angle. So I'm going to vary that to give it some variation. Okay, now the trees here in the middle ground, they're closer to me, so they're going to have more color and more contrast. Just taking my brush rather raggedly, sort of jamming it up there into this area. I'll bring some of this green area down in here because the shadows are not hitting everywhere along that edge of the bank. I want to be able to see some of the foliage down in here where the sunlight's still penetrating through those trees. There, I varied that shape some, just enough I think, so it doesn't repeat the line of this mountain. Where the water meets the edge of this bank, we've got some green grasses in there, and I'll pull that line right across there, and then I'll take the tip of my brush and flip this up this way to make that look like there's some grasses growing up. There are some dark passages in here, so at this point I'm going to start making some areas darker, some areas lighter, just pushing these values around. Some of these shadows are starting to reach clear across the river now. At this time of day, where the sun just starts to move so fast. But I like the way those shadows are coming across the river because they come into this bank and they make a nice little shadow right up over the bank. Let's make 3 of those. Right up in there. Okay. I'm going to scumble in some little dark area where these rocks are. Just drag some horizontal lines across this way to represent some of the reflections of the water. Right back there, I see where the river curves around, And that will make a nice little indication there to bring the eye back into that area. I don't see this exactly the way I'm painting it, but I'm adjusting it so I think I can get the best composition I can, at least out here in the field. Well, that sun's starting to go down now. It's important in a painting that the edge of the form describe the object that's being painted. So in this case, the edge of the form being this tree is really very important to get the shape of that tree right. It doesn't matter what's happening inside the tree area nearly as much as what's going on at the edge of the form. I'll bring this up like that, and I'll just flip this out. See, that's the edge of the form I'm talking about that's important. That will describe these trees here. And I'll keep going. We just have more and more of them as we come up this way. Right on this tree, we'll flip that right out. Here's where I pick up the brighter colors. For instance, this yellow in the tree here. This is the tree right in the foreground. Ooh, I have to be careful not to fight with this color down here. This is the most brilliant part of the painting, so I have to be careful not to get this anywhere near as brilliant as this. So I have to kind of hold myself back, put in a few more dark spots in there. It's a nice bush down here, and again, I'll use the side of my brush for painting this. Just flip this up right on the side. It's really fun to shove these oil paints around. I'm going to refine this area right here because it looks a little too flat for me right now. So I'm going to put a few more areas of weeds and things where the shadow is hitting them and causing some variation in these values, especially towards the back, right back there. And maybe some negative areas of the light green. Touch some in here. Now I need to pick up a smaller brush and put in a few of those rocks down there. So I'll mix up some white. Now if I had some yellow ochre, that would be a good color to use, but Indian yellow, that'll do the job. Maybe a touch of red. Now I can see where it was a good thing to make this as dark as I did, because if I didn't make that as dark as it is, these rocks would not have shown up very well. Back here we have a whole lot of rocks, and they tend to blend together, so you don't really see them as individual rocks. So what will describe those rocks, hopefully, is some more detail in the rocks in the foreground. And that will let the viewer know really what's going on in the background. I'm loading my brush up with quite a bit of paint to put these rocks on. Putting them on fairly heavy. And I'll touch a few rocks out on the edge of this flat area here where these rocks are. And then I'll touch in a few dark areas as well, because there's a lot of shadows going on one side of these rocks. A little more dark color up here where these trees are. I want these shadows to stand out more than they are, so I'm going to put some water over on this side, and that will define the shadows in between where I'm putting this water. I have to load my brush up pretty good, because if I don't, all these paints will blend together. So one way to have this light blue show up is to load the brush up and lay it over there fairly heavy. Down here, these rocks that are all wet tend to look very warm color with a sort of a dull reddish orange. So I'll put in some of that right in here. Okay, now I'm going to pick up a small pointed brush, and with sort of a middle gray color, I'm going to add a few of these tree trunks. And I don't want to show them going all the way down. I'll describe a little bit of them here, a little bit of them there. They'll sort of be lost and found. I see them, then I don't see them, then I see them again. Over here we have this large tree right in the foreground. We have a number of branches dipping off to the side here. I'm running out of light here. The sun has gone down much faster than I thought, but one way to give myself a quick indication of where some of these tree trunks are is just to use the end of my brush here. I can just sort of scrape in a few tree trunks here and there, just as a visual guide. Then when I get back to the studio, it'll give me a little bit more of a memory as to where all this was. I'm going to make this a lighter green, yellow-green right here, because I want this area right in here to be the focal point, the center of interest. Let me just grab some Indian yellow and some green and scumble what might look like a few little leaves and foliage over this area, because that just looks too warm right now. I do want some of that warmth to come through. And I'll put a hint of this green grass back in behind some of these trees. Well, the sun is still plenty bright, but it's about to go behind this mountain back there, and that's going to change everything. So I think I'll take some photographs now of this scene, and we'll take those photographs back into the studio for good reference, and we'll finish the painting there.
Our campground is near Powell Junction on the Lochsa River. It's very quiet and peaceful in these deep woods, and mornings are especially pleasant for bird watching and for meeting fellow campers and animal lovers walking their pets. Often conversations spring up about good places to visit next, local restaurants and specialty foods, and pet-friendly trails. The full-time RVers have some great travel experiences they're usually happy to share, and I get some of my best ideas for future trips from them. What I like about traveling with a pet is it seems to bring me closer to nature, slowing me down enough to really observe my surroundings. I'd probably miss lots of things if I didn't have this little dog, who came from a rescue shelter and is still shy at first, but warms up and does well, mingling with different species and new people. Mick was most impressed by the blue-eyed ragdoll cats, who travel with a Labrador Retriever and have their own screened-in porch. Later we drove up to the Lolo Pass Visitor Center along the beautiful Idaho byway, which commemorates the expedition by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Lewis and Clark party crossed this pass in 1805, westbound for the Pacific after a long detour south. From the headwaters of the Missouri, they had crossed the mountains to the Salmon River, but found it impassable. So they traded for pack horses, hired an Indian guide, and came north to an Indian trail across the mountains. Thinking about their experience is a long way from traveling in a motorhome. That part is entirely different. However, it's exciting to know we share the same scenic views, one of which Roger can capture on canvas and share with you.
Well, here we are back in the studio, and sometimes it's easier to evaluate a painting once I get back here where I have some more controlled conditions. So here are the few things I did to complete this painting. Since this was painted late in the afternoon, the light was changing very quickly. So I had to use my reference photo I took out in the field, and I used my laptop monitor here to view the painting. But there's a problem with using photographs rather than painting in real life. I can never get nearly as much information from a photograph as I can from being there in real life. For instance, this area right here was dark and in shadow, and in the photograph that turns to almost black. But in real life I could see a number of greens in it that I couldn't see on the laptop. But in other ways, working from photographs really does help, especially when the light has been changing here. At least I have something to work by. Well, here in this painting, I noticed that this area right here, there was very little contrast. So I lightened these areas here to put some sunlight on these trees. It made a little difference between the mountains back here and these trees in the foreground. Just a little bit of contrast. So as I mentioned earlier, I could see quite a bit of color down here in real life. So I enhanced that some more with some greens and more texture. The edge of the form describes an object. So right here, I used a small brush to describe the edge of those trees. Very important to describe the edge here. In this area here, not nearly as important to describe it. But up here, you can really tell it's a tree just by the edge of the form and that contrast between the sky and the tree. The area in here was slightly patchy, so I blended these greens together to pull that shape into one larger area. I added and arranged more of the rocks down here on the bank of the river. I pretty much put them in all in sort of a white color before, a whitish gray color. So now I added some warm colors and some cool colors of these rocks. I added this light blue color here because this area here was shallow with rocks. Out here it was a bit rougher where the water was moving. But in here, the rocks were protecting this water somewhat, so it got a chance to reflect some of this sky. So I put these light blue colors in here simply because the water was calm, wasn't reflecting any of that movement. With the small brush, I dragged some of this wet paint on some of these dark rocks down into the water, creating what looked like a reflection. In the lower left here of the painting, I added more texture and more color in the foreground where there was more weeds and some brush. And with a very small brush, I added more of these branches. There were quite a few dead-looking branches on a few of these trees, so I added some of these branches with some warm colors, some with cool colors. Cerulean blue was added right in here, just to create some distance between these trees in the foreground and the ones in the background. With a very small brush, I added these tree trunks, kept them a warm color, basically yellow ochre and some white. This was much easier to do back here in the studio than it would be in the field, since this was still very wet at that time. And to finish the painting, I put in this misty looking cloud area. It just softened this area right back here. I thought it added a little bit of character to the painting. Well, Sarah and I enjoyed camping and visiting Idaho. This river was a beautiful place. There were a lot of beautiful things to paint.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.